Well, welcome everyone. I'm Ron Don Levy, and as you can see, um, this will be Peace Through Perspective. And we'll be talking about different ways we can utilize our vantage point on the world and the way we're seeing things to improve our own mood, whether it's to reduce anxiety or depression or just to have a little bit more calm or perspective. Um, and so that's what we'll be working on tonight. I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. Just double check over here, see what that looks like. So we do this webinar once a month, and we do it on a bunch of topics, as you can see. And this week we'll be focusing on DBT as an approach and some of the skills through DBT that we can utilize in order to cultivate our focus on wellness and our focus on perspective. So somebody can just throw up in the chat that you can see the screen. Okay, that would be great. And there we go. So peace through perspective. So we have the example of the rose tinted glasses or the rose colored glasses, and perspective transforms obstacles into opportunities. So as you can see, we have different ways of looking at the world that do change our perspective. And both of these perspectives are kind of looking at things from a positive frame. Sometimes people can say if you push your perspective too positive, you can move to toxic positivity, and that's not going to be our goal today. But we'll talk about the reality of what perspective provides for all of us. Here are some other examples. The standard glass, half empty, half full. And then the one on the other side I thought was pretty unique. Takes just a second to kind of get what's going on, but definitely there are different perspectives. So are we looking at this with our rose-colored glasses, or sometimes our rose-colored glasses not allowing us to see reality? Does it prevent us from facing the truth? So that's just a fun way to kind of introduce the idea of perspective. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll try to keep an eye on that. We're going to talk about DBT as a resource. Of course, we're going to talk about what DBT is. We'll talk about dialectics in general. What does the word mean? What's the concept? How is it applied? Then we're going to talk through the DBT assumptions and the biosocial theory. These come from the beginning and the general handouts of the DBT workbook. And I believe that they form the thread that ties all of the skills training sessions or sections, excuse me, together. And we'll talk about what those are as well. And then Toward the end, we will have talked a little bit about mindfulness, and so we're going to talk about wise mind a little and do a little um, mindfulness activity, and then I'll address some questions, and hopefully we'll have a good frame on what we need. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat as we go, and I will get to them at the end. So I hope you find this helpful. So the first thing, big picture, what is DBT? And it's dialectical behavior therapy. And dialectical means that more than one thing can be true, basically. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But basically, opening up our ability to see things and to see from other people's perspectives as best we can, and to hold space for that. And so we'll talk about that some more as well. It was created by Marshall Linehan, as you can see on the graphic, but Marshall Linehan actually had borderline personality disorder, and through her own challenges and moving through the opportunity of school and college, she realized she had to develop some very specific skills in order to get through that because of her own um, own situation. So by the time she was a psychologist, she did some additional research and put together dialectical behavior therapy. It was published in the late 80s, early 90s, and there was a lot of research that went into it. And a lot of the things that she did research were based on some of the skills that she had developed as well. She put it in a developed package. If you look up DBT online, you will see hundreds and hundreds of written resources, individual workbooks to go through, but they're all based on these basic skills from Marshall Linehan. As we go on, basically there are some major concepts that it's formed around, and we'll talk about some of those, and also the main sections, mindfulness. Marshall Linehan eventually became a Zen master, and so obviously that approach of meditation and perspective and being present have a huge impact on the work. Interpersonal effectiveness, great section, a lot of really super stuff in there. Emotion regulation, it's exactly what it sounds like. And distress tolerance. So these things are all very helpful in the program of DBT, but we're going to focus on just some of the main framework and skills that are revelatory in changing one's perspective and bringing more internal peace, or to my way of thinking, definitely internal peace. So the main concepts are dialectical thinking, which I said we're going to talk a little bit more about, acceptance, change, and validation. We'll talk about each of these things, but change is a constant, and it's talked about in the assumptions that we'll talk about. Acceptance, radical acceptance, is one of the main thrusts in the distress tolerance section, and it's really a cornerstone. Validation, of course, if we can see someone else's perspective and we can understand their thoughts or their perspective on something or their beliefs about it, even though we don't have to say that they are true or they are correct or that we agree with them 100%. But if we can say, oh, I can really understand why you thought that, or I can really understand where you're coming from. And that's what validation is about. We'll talk about that just a little bit more as well. So with that said, let's jump into that first part. So when you look at this picture, you can see it's an elephant. In this case, there's a bunch of blindfolded people. Um, the original parable dates back to, I think what they said was 500 BC, and it's the parable of the blind monks and the elephant. And so these monks come upon an elephant and they're trying to figure out what an elephant is. And since they're blind, they can only do it by touch. And they each get a different area because an elephant is very large. So they end up, you know, um, the side feels like a wall because it's very firm and immovable. And the leg feels like the trunk of a tree. And the tusk, it has a sharp point and is very hard, um, and and smooth, and so it's like a spear. The tail is like a rope. And so we can see all those things, but all those perspectives, each of the blind people sees through their own experience something very different. And although none of them are actually wrong in their description, they're also, each and every one of them, incorrect because they don't have the full picture. And so that gives us that idea of perspective as, it's not exact, it's not all or nothing. It's not that there isn't truth, just that perspective changes our ability to see the details and to see it in the same way or from the same angle. So that said, there's some resources. Some of the main things that I'm going to be talking about here, which I think are very impactful, are the skills training assumptions, which I will have some stuff outlined, but the actual pages from the book, which is just a couple of them, obviously, on skills training assumptions from the general handouts, number 4, and general handout number 5, biosocial theory. So if you click on that, or scan the QR code, that's available to you there. And just to make sure, I'm going to copy the link address and put it in the chat in case you need it for the people who are here. All right. And I'm really excited that everyone's here and participating in the chat. And we'll just move right on from there. Okay. So as we go on to the assumptions, there are 7 basic assumptions, and this is just kind of, perspective is a way of reframing. And actually, I think, yeah. So I'm gonna pause. I'm going to go back to dialectics. So dialectics, really, it's all about more than one thing can be true. And obviously this picture gives us a good idea of that. But another example is that, you know, my best friend may be very generous and very kind and very helpful. But my best friend might also be a little bit moody and sometimes very difficult to deal with. Both things are true. They're opposite, but both things are true. So that dialectical idea kind of goes back to um, the idea of dialectics, to me, is very much related to avoiding all or nothing thinking. It's that the far ends of the spectrum, if we go way over here and way over here, as our society is very polarized right now, we can think of politics or being involved in an argument. And when we're on one end or the other, it seems like there's nothing but controversy, nothing but disagreement. And the reality is that those far ends of the spectrum are very opposite. But most of us have a lot of agreement and commonality in the in-between space. So, for example, we may I always hesitate to grab too difficult a subject, but we might all agree in the middle that um, spirituality has its place. Some people believe that spirituality is just one expression of, say, for example, um, organized religion. And some people would say that spirituality is really more of a function of being connected to nature, um, or believing in fate. And so even though those things are very disparate and very separate, the idea that spirituality benefits us all in some way, it can still be something that is agreed upon. So that's just one example, and there are many different examples of that dialectical approach. So when we jump into the assumptions, it kind of helps us get there as well. And so the first skills training assumption, which obviously the assumptions are something we're believing, but we're believing it for the purpose of um, acquiring knowledge. So it's not necessarily an absolute truth. But if we make this assumption and we use it as part of our frame, then it can help us moving through how we interact in the world. So the first belief is people are doing the best they can, or assumption. Um, and in all the assumptions, when it says people, people aren't people isn't other people. It's really everyone. It's you and it's me and it's everyone else. And we believe that I know I'm doing the best I can on any given day at any given time. Um, if I didn't sleep last night, I might not be doing quite as well as a day that I've slept well. If I am not feeling well, I might not be doing as well. There are any number of reasons why my best might be different today than my best would be the day before or tomorrow. So that said, people are doing the best they can at any given point in time. So that means I believe that you're doing the best you can, and you believe that I'm doing the best I can, and that applies to other people we encounter during our day, our lives. The second one is people want to improve. It's very common that we want to improve, and we know that even though we feel like we did our best yesterday or we're going to do our best tomorrow, we know that there's always room for improvement. And so we always want to improve our lives, be happy, be content. And so that's me, you, and everybody. So the next one is people need to do better, try harder, and be more motivated to change. And so that links back to change being a real important thing in DBT, being open to the idea that figuring out what's not working and finding out what the change is to make things work better is going to be part of our approach. Sometimes we can't change things, and then acceptance is the alternative. And we'll talk about that some more too. So people need to do better, try harder, and be more motivated to change. It doesn't mean that that doing better and trying harder are always going to be enough. They're not necessarily enough to solve the problem. And so change might need to take place. Now we get into the detail. So this one says people may not have caused all of our own problems, and you'll see the way it switches there. It says people may not have caused all of our own. And that leads back to the idea that people is not other people. It's definitely all people, me, you, and everyone. So even though you, for example, did not cause your own problem, you're still required to solve them. And so I know the other three were pretty self-explanatory, and so they were pretty straightforward. This one I have a little bit more of a anecdote for. So if you're driving in your car and the gas gauge is broken, well, when you run out of gas, if the gas gauge is broken, it was giving you the wrong information. So it's not your fault that you didn't read the gas gauge right. It wasn't giving you the right information. But the reality is, if you're in, in the second lane from the right on the highway and you run out of gas and you don't even get all the way over to the side, you're impeding the flow of traffic. Your car's in the way. You need to get it out of the way. You need to get to safety. You need to get some gas for your car and get your car out of the way. So sitting there and being concerned about why this happened, or blaming the gas gauge or the broken car or whoever didn't fix the car right or whatever, is not going to be helpful. You're just going to have to solve the problem because you're in the middle of it. And you're the one behind the wheel of the car, so you're the one who has to get the car off the road. That said, obviously you jump in, grab your phone and you call Harris County Steer and Clear It, and they come and give you gas or get your car off and take you to the nearest gas station, and it's free. And if you don't know about that, you can call 311 and ask them about it. But there's a specific number for that too. But and if you're not in Houston, that's not very helpful, but there is a way to do that. So all that to say, we may not be the cause of a particular problem, but we have to figure out what to do when we are impacted by a situation. So, new behavior has to be learned in all relevant contexts. And so if we go through some of the skills that we learn in DBT or just in our daily lives, if we don't know how to apply them in different ways or in different circumstances, they don't become all that useful. So it's kind of like being able to understand math in a way that you can apply it to different situations. You can apply it to it being helpful when you're grocery shopping. You can apply it to understanding percentages when it comes to interest rates buying a car, not just for counting things or doing an abstract math problem that doesn't have other application. Same thing is if we learn how to, through mindfulness, to be more focused, to be more present, possibly to be more relaxed. If we know how to do that, but we can only do it when it's the time that we've set aside to do a mindfulness exercise. And we can't do it when we're experiencing a real world scenario. For example, we have a hard time being present when we're at a ballet event for our daughter or granddaughter or niece. So we're worried about the costuming that we helped with beforehand, or we're worried about getting the perfect picture for the grandparents, or we're worried about recording it instead of just watching it and being there. And so those would not be great examples of being present in the moment, which is part of that mindfulness piece. So those are some examples. And this next one is one of my favorites. All behaviors, actions, thoughts, and emotions are caused. Now, this one is really important in that we know that everything has a cause. Sometimes when people first read this, they think um, everything happens for a reason. That's a different thing. Not necessarily something that I ascribe to, but it's more of a philosophy about why things happen, as opposed to this is focused on all behaviors, whatever they are caused. There's some cause to why the behavior is the way it is, whether it's an action or a thought or an emotion. So one example for this is, and uh, here's the highway example again, just because it seems to lend itself to this. If someone cuts you off on the highway, and you're shocked, what the heck, right? And you want to be very angry and upset. That makes sense. Um, and initially you are, part of that is, that I I need to make sure that we didn't get hit and we didn't get run off the road. But as soon as that anxiety has passed, which is almost immediately, you you change your behavior, you make sure you're safe, but sometimes then you're still riled up. Well, that's a great chance to use this particular idea. If everything's caused, then what caused the other car to cut you off? Now, there's a small chance that they were just a jerk and they like seeing people, they malevolently want to make sure that other people are having a hard time on the road, that they're scared, that they become dysregulated, um, that they're very aggressive and they don't care about others, or they actually want to annoy others. I don't think that's very common. So it's possible. But let's just say that at least 9 out of 10 possibilities, or maybe even more, uh, you know, um, are other reasons. So here's some of the other possible reasons. They're trying to get to the hospital because someone's in the car who's going to have a baby. They are feeling like they're having a heart attack and they're trying to pull off to the edge of the road so they don't cause more problems. Maybe the cause is that they had a really crappy driving instructor um, that didn't teach them well to plan ahead and know where their turns are and to stay in the right lane if you're going slowly and to, pull over at the right time. Maybe they didn't really have a teacher at all because they didn't have the resources or the parental support to have that. Maybe they just got a call um, just before they got on the highway that their uh, sibling is in the hospital and they're trying to get there. And maybe they just didn't see you because they didn't look over their shoulder correctly and they cut you off. The reality is you probably corrected, and as soon as you corrected and kept everybody safe, you becoming dysregulated and being upset about it probably isn't going to keep you safe. So the one circumstance where it seems like it would be justified to be really, really angry at the other person who cut you off is if they did it malevolently, if they did it on purpose, or they did it because they just could care less about anybody but themselves. And in that case, that would be the time you're justified probably to honk at them or chase them down and yell at them. But if they happen to be really malevolent, then that might be the very worst time to follow them and to be upset with them, because they might just be that very um the wrong person to follow in a situation like that, which if you follow them, then that might make you that wrong person too. So probably let bygones be bygones, and if you kept yourself safe, keep it at that. That said, that's just one example of everything has a cause. um, One of the causes of someone being very defensive, for example, might be that the way they interacted with their family um, was always, everybody was always accusing one another and coming at one another in an aggressive way. And so defensive um, attitudes and comments and that kind of thing were the norm. Um, when we talk about thoughts and emotions, we'll talk a little bit more about emotions, especially when we talk about the biosocial theory, which is the next thing we're going to do, but also thoughts. I always think of thoughts as our big T thoughts, or not all thoughts are that, but our big T thoughts are our values. And they're kind of almost like the perspective we're talking about, how we look at things. And so the big T thoughts um, help us. They're kind of almost like the lens that we see things through, right? And if we try to make that lens more like the rose-colored glasses, by thinking, oh, well, they they did that for any number of reasons that are probably not mean or nasty or vicious. So that minimizes um, the impact of what we're thinking might have happened. So that's just an example. I know I went on a tangent there for the thoughts for just a second, but we're going to get to those emotions, and that'll make a lot of sense too. This is a huge one. So figuring out and changing the causes of behavior work better than judging and blaming. So judging and blaming is easy. Easy in that it pushes things away from our fault. It makes us feel like we haven't done the wrong thing or made a mistake. But at the same time, it doesn't it doesn't bring solutions. It doesn't create change. So if we want things to turn out better, then we might need to make some of the changes necessary um, to get the results that we want. And so judging and blaming is is kind of throwing out a lot of why in the experience rather than putting how, as in how to fix it or how to do it better, or possibly even just how to do it better the next time, if that's what we're left with. So the whole idea that, you know, that I have some experience with 12 step, and I think that 12 step overlaps with DBT quite a bit in this perspective piece, because we can't change everything. And so we need to approach the world in order to know um, what we can change, what we can't change, and figuring out the difference. So, and the 12-step reference is the serenity prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so that whole idea of approaching it with a broad perspective and knowing that it could be any one of those three, and sometimes it might be even more than one. So, um, I think talking about skills training is probably a little bit more fun when you have a lot of interaction in the space. Um, but moving on to biosocial theory. So one of the other things that DBT approaches is really this awareness of one's own emotions and others' emotions. Um, in that we all have our own, um, we're wired the way we are. And so emotion regulation is one of those sections. And so emotion regulation, of course, is being open to the idea um, that everybody has their own approach and their own emotional responses. And they may be based on a whole bunch of things, their big T thoughts, their beliefs, their past experiences, and maybe some of what we're about to talk about, how they're wired biologically. But the big point here is um, that regardless, our emotions are information. They're not, and even though we have urges because of our emotions sometimes, um, they're not directions. They're information, they're not instructions. And so to understand that our emotions give us something that we may need, they give us information about um, what the easy evaluation of a circumstance is. Um, but they don't always give us everything that we need. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about wise mind, but um, emotional vulnerability is biological. It's simply how some people are born. So the idea that some of us are more or less sensitive than others, that we are more reactive than others, or that we may have a more intense internal experience than others. When I describe this, I very often um, talk about it kind of like if we think of a graph and we think of everybody has an emotional reactive level, or different levels throughout the day. And if our graph lingers around about a 2, our emotions kind of stay at a 2 most of the time. And we have a hard time getting out of the house. We couldn't find our keys. Um, we left our glasses upstairs, had to run back and get them. So then we come down the stairs or whatever, and we stub our toe. So we're normally at a 2, but by the time we almost get to the car, we're at a 4. We're frustrated. We're a little bit anxious. We're worried that we're going to be late. But we sit in the car, we get it going, we're on our way, and we realize the traffic's not so bad. We look at the clock and we realize we're not quite as late as we thought we were. And we just come on back down to a 3 and we just kind of linger there. So going from a 2 to a 4 is not all that much. So it's a little bit, if we get really upset, maybe the way we're wired, we get to a 5 or even a 6 at some point during the day. But if we linger from 2 to 6 and 6 is extreme for us, then, it is what it is. Another person could have a totally different experience. They could be more intense. They could linger at about a 5 most of the day as they start out the day. So they just start out, they're not a morning person. They're running around like a crazy person trying to get it all done and get out because they slept 10 minutes too long because they just kept hitting the snooze button. And they just live kind of at a 5, right? They talk faster, they move faster, they always seem uptight. And that might be me. So they're sitting like at a 5 or a 6. But then when they get upset or when something happens and it seems big and seems overwhelming, their 6 jumps up to an 8 or a 9 pretty easily. And then their 9 looks like other people's, oh my gosh, the world is coming apart. And so if their baseline is more like a 5, then their spikes are going to be considerably higher than the people whose baseline is a 2. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, is that everybody kind of is wired a little bit differently. Um, and biology isn't the only thing that has an impact, but so some people might experience emotions more often, and more frequently, and sometimes they might have an emotional response that seems out of the blue. They'll just be hit with an emotion and they might not even see, is it related to the weather? Is it related to what happened 10 minutes ago? Is it related to something that happened 3 days ago that they hadn't finished processing? And so that can be a thing too. So moving on, another biological aspect um, is impulsivity. Um, Regulating action is harder for some than others. When we have an emotional response and then we have an action urge from that emotion response, um, sometimes people do stuff without thinking. Um, and whether that's being more reactive in the way we um, respond to someone or react to someone instead of respond, being more defensive first rather than trying to hold space and check for understanding, ask questions about what the person has just said instead of assuming that they have a negative intent with their question or their statement. Oh, I'm being attacked. I'm going to be defensive. And some people just have that perception because they are more reactive. And so that might be part of the response from some people because it's biological. It's just kind of the way they're wired. Um, and sometimes their responses might seem to come out of nowhere. Um, it can be really hard for people who have a more a biologically more triggered impulsivity kind of thing. Um, Almost like they feel like they can't control behaviors that come from an emotional response. It's almost like they're overwhelmed and they don't have a choice. Now, we all know we can take the perspective that um, and work on the skill of understanding that even when we have a very strong action urge based on an emotion, we can teach ourselves to slow that process down a little bit and to think about how we're going to respond instead of react. But part of that comes through learning skills, awareness. And so understanding that some people, before they really engage in that awareness and working on skills to do that better, they might just be wired that way. So, um, that said, we have these couple ways that we're wired biologically. And then we also have the rest of the theory, which is social. So the biosocial theory really is saying that if we're very reactive and we grew up in an environment where the people around us weren't very reactive, they were very chill and mellow, and they didn't understand why a particular person was more reactive. It can be very invalidating for people to say, "You're overreacting. What's the big deal? Calm down." And that can be very invalidating. Um, we also have circumstances where um, our circumstance is validating in that we might be overwhelmingly emotional, or have higher reactivity. I always talk about the kid in the grocery cart who grabs for the chocolate and mom tries to take it away. And the kid starts screaming and throwing a tantrum. And mom's like, no, we can have a treat when we get home, but we can't do it right now. We got to put it back. And they just get so loud and so overwhelmed that finally mom says, okay, 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 you can have it, because she's embarrassed and she doesn't want to deal with it. Well, then the lesson there, or the validation that kid is getting, is that if they throw a big enough fit, they'll get their way. And so if that happens on a consistent basis, then the validation is pushing that more reactive behavior. So you can have that interaction that is invalidating to your natural response biologically, or you can have the opposite. And so either way, it can create circumstances where it's difficult to interact. Um, so sometimes the people around you don't know how to validate your experience because theirs is so different. Um, or maybe they're under high stress, and they don't have the resources to know how to interact with you. Um, and one of the things it says on the sheet is that you may just be a poor fit between you and your social environment. Maybe you're a tulip in a rose garden as opposed to a rose in a rose garden, or the other way around. Um, an ineffective social environment is a problem when you want to learn to regulate emotions and actions. So even if it's been validating because your family is all emotionally reactive and everybody's loud um and it you solve problems by arguing out and yelling and screaming, that seems normal, but then you go to another environment and that doesn't work. You know, it's like that at home, but it's not like that at school. It's like that um at home, but it's not like that at work, or the other way around, something like that. So it's hard um when you want to learn to regulate your emotions, but the interaction that you have doesn't really provide that. So, and the last one, it's the transactions that count between the person and the social environment. In other words, biology and social environment influence each other. So both influence the each individual. Um, so if we are very validated by those around us in our reactive behavior, then we think that it's working for us and that it's normal. If we're very reactive and we're invalidated, then we might shut down or believe that our emotions are wrong, or that they shouldn't be expressed. And then we believe that our internal experience is wrong, which makes us feel wrong, which creates a sense of shame. So knowing that about ourselves, that one way or another, that biology is part of who we are. And yes, we can make some adaptations and changes to that if we want um, to be more effective in certain environments, but we have to consider that environment as well. And so it goes back and forth. The social environment impacts us the way we are, and we try to change, it influences us, and then our reactions influence our social environment, and back and forth and back and forth. And so that's the biosocial theory. Um, and so the next step, if we go back and we look real quick at our agenda, I probably should have planned to do that in a different way, but um, so what was DBT? Dialectics is that avoiding all or nothing thinking, finding the middle ground, looking for other people's perspectives, knowing that it's not just one or the other, this or that, black or white, but it also can be, and I don't think I said this earlier, both and. So that's kind of the reframe there is dialectically, if we can see both sides, then it makes it easier for us to interact and to understand where others might be coming from. So both and is kind of that culmination of how we do that approach. Um, so getting back to that next part is wise mind, and then we're going to do a really quick mindfulness technique. And then you will have those resources and I'll talk about questions. I saw one that's going to be good. So here, this Venn diagram, as it were, shows logical mind. And sometimes we call it reasonable mind. And so the goal here is that just like we were talking about emotional reactivity and impulsivity, is we all have what and experience emotion mind. And emotion mind, if it's in control completely, if we're totally in emotion mind, then we're, hot tempered, we're mood dependent, we're emotion focused. And so the people who are biologically wired that way, they might be in emotion mind a little more. Someone who's a little more laid back um, or analytical might be seem more cool or rational or task focused. It's all about organization and reason. Logical mind, reasonable mind. You're ruled by facts and logic and pragmatics. Um, so values and feelings in when you're in logical mind, reasonable mind, they're not very important. The problem there is you might make decisions if you're all in reasonable mind or logical mind that don't hold any space or don't consider how people might feel about it. It might be efficient for getting a specific task done, but is it going to um, push people away or upset people in the process because of the way it was done or the people who weren't considered in doing it? Emotion mind, on the other hand, if you're ruled by your moods and feelings and urges to do or say things, then you're not creating, you're not always making good decisions because you might not consider some of the outcomes with regard to the details. I mean, are we going to get the result that we need, even though being more in emotion mind, we've considered how people are going to react, but are we getting the results that we need as well? And so the idea is finding the middle path, finding wise mind. And so we think both logically and emotionally. We consider people's feelings in our decisions, but we also consider the facts and what are the outcomes that we need. And um, we're try to be um, logical and focused on what the outcomes will be. And so a balance by considering people our emotions and their emotions, and we consider the details and the outcome of our decisions and the way we work. So this is what we call finding the middle path or using wise mind. And so we've gone through a lot of stuff, obviously. And one of that first section of DBT, after we do things like um, the biosocial model and the assumptions, is we start by creating a practice of mindfulness. And a mindfulness practice usually includes some practice of breathing, focusing on the breath, or maybe a um, five senses grounding technique. And there are a bunch of different things that we can do in that way, just so everybody has at least one opportunity. I've put this link here, and I'm just going to let it kind of show you one example of a breathing technique. Typically, with breathing, we try to sit tall and relaxed with our feet on the floor. We can lay down, but if we're already sitting, that sitting up a little bit is good. And then we want to do deep belly breathing. And there's a whole way to talk through doing that as well. But this is just one example of a breathing technique that will help you regulate yourself. So look at this real quick, and then we'll do one more activity and then talk about questions. Inhale, hold. So there are a lot of options for breathing activities that you can find on YouTube or other places online. The Calm app is a really great way to start a mindfulness practice in that way. I like this one because it doesn't have you breathe in too long or exhale too long. It also doesn't have you hold for an inordinate amount of time. If you hold between the in breath and the out breath, or the exhale and the inhale going back around, sometimes if they have you hold too long, it becomes awkward or uncomfortable. And so anytime you need to adapt something so it works for you, feel free to do that. But this one is usually a pretty good one. Another thing I like about this is you can turn it on your phone and turn off the sound, and you can still see the breathing. And so you could do this while you're sitting at your desk at work, or um, just, sitting outside or whatever. And it will just help you regulate a little bit. And then, well, that's not where I wanted to go. There we go. And so this last thing um, for doing a wise mind practice, um, I have a visual for you there. And this is one of my favorite things, and it just takes a minute. I know we're just about out of time, but now that we've breathed, imagine that you are by a clear blue lake on a beautiful sunny day. Then imagine that you're a small, flake of stone, flat and light. Imagine that you've been tossed out onto this beautiful lake and are now gently, slowly floating through the calm, clear blue water to the lake's smooth, sandy bottom. Notice what you see, what you feel as you float down, perhaps in slow circles, gently floating toward the bottom. As you reach the bottom of the lake, settle your attention there within yourself. Notice the serenity of the lake. Become aware of the calmness and quiet, both at the bottom of the lake and deep within. As you reach the center of yourself, settle your attention there. So that's just one example of quick mindfulness reflection or technique or practice. Um, Great opportunities to find things online. Um, they're all over. Um, but the Calm app is really good. And if you look up the Calm app, it'll pull up other similar apps for you to consider as well. So there are a lot of great resources. My contact information, of course, you can get from here. And if you need any other resources or have any other questions, let me know. And obviously, for more information, you can call Edens, and that information is there. And I'm just going to double check on the questions. I know there was one, and there's another graphic of the perspective from the elephants. And I'll look real quick at the chat. I know there was one question. So how would we communicate with someone who reacts right away and possibly be at level 5 when you yourself are communicating at a level 2, if that makes sense? So yeah, of course that makes sense. Because sometimes that's exactly what happens. Sometimes it's because they might misread what we've said, even if we're trying to communicate carefully. A lot of times people are more reactive when what we communicate isn't an I statement. So using an I statement, in other words, I feel sad when we don't have an opportunity to talk before going to bed, as opposed to we never talk before we go to bed. So we never, and that sounds like, or you could say, you never take time to talk to me before we go to bed. It's always a last minute thing. Sounds much more accusatory. Sounds as if you're implying blame or guilt or fault. And so those other things that we said with the assumptions, sometimes it's how we start. If somebody comes back at you at a 5 right away and you are communicating carefully, your words have been chosen carefully, and you're at a 2, then sometimes that's a boundary issue. And so you might need to just say, Wow. I, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for you to have such a strong reaction. Maybe I didn't say that right. Or, wow, with that strong a reaction, maybe we need to take a break. So boundaries are always a good way to work on that. But sometimes people's levels are different than ours, and so we have to try to validate them and see their perspective as best we can. So there's a bunch of answers to that, but without a more interactive response, it's hard to go there. Thank you so much for participating tonight. And I hope that you guys got something from what we talked about this evening. And I hope your journey toward peace through perspective is a good one. And I hope that you use the resources well. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for being here.